Election Clause. Common Interpretation by Michael T. Morley and Franita Tolson. The Elections Clause is a primary source of constitutional authority to regulate the elections for the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. The clause directs and empowers states to determine the times, places, and manner of congressional elections, subject to Congress's authority to make or alter state regulations. It grants each level of government the authority to enact a complete code for such elections, including rules concerning public notices, voter registration, voter protection, fraud prevention, vote counting, and determination of election results. Whenever a state enacts a law relating to a congressional election, it's exercising power under the Elections Clause. States do not have any inherent authority to enact such measures. Although the Election Clause makes the states primarily responsible for regulating congressional elections, it vests ultimate power in Congress. Congress may pass federal laws regulating congressional elections that automatically displace or preempt any contrary state statutes or enact its own regulations concerning those aspects of elections that the states may not have addressed. The framers of the Constitution were concerned that the states might establish unfair election procedures or attempt to undermine the national government by refusing to hold elections for Congress. They empower Congress to step in and regulate such elections as a self-defense mechanism. On occasion, Congress have exercised its power to make or alter rules concerning congressional elections, and some of its laws lie at the very heart of the modern electoral process. It established a single national election day for congressional elections and mandated that states with multiple representatives in the U.S. House divide themselves into congressional districts rather than electing all of their representatives at large. Congress also has enacted statutes limiting the amount of money that people may contribute to candidates for Congress, requiring that people publicly disclose most election-related spending, mandating that voter registration forms be made available at various public offices, and requiring states to ensure the accuracy of the voter registration rules. The power of states and Congress to regulate congressional elections under the Elections Clause is subject to express and implicit limits. Fundamentally, neither entity can enact law under the Election Clause that violate other constitutional provisions. For example, the Constitution specifies that anyone who is eligible to vote for the larger halls of a state legislature may vote for the U.S. House and U.S. Senate as well. The Election Clause does not permit either the state or Congress to override those provisions by establishing additional qualifications for voting for Congress. Likewise, the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution protects the fundamental right to vote, barring states from needlessly imposing substantial burdens on the right. When a law specifies that a person must satisfy certain requirements or follow certain procedures in order to vote, a court must determine whether it is a reasonable regulation of the electoral process under the Elections Clause, or instead undermines the right to vote. Laws requiring people to register to vote in advance of elections or mandating that they vote at their assigned polling places I examined the types of restrictions that the election clause permits. The Constitution also specifies age, residence, and citizenship requirements to run for the House or Senate. Individuals who satisfy those requirements cannot be prohibited from running for office for failing to satisfy other qualifications. States can, however, impose reasonable ballot access restrictions that a candidate must fulfill in order to appear on the ballot, such as submitting a petition signed by a certain number of registered voters. The Supreme Court has aggressively enforced this restriction by invalidating various attempts to impose term limits on members of Congress. In U.S. Term Limits Incorporation versus Thornton, 1995, the courts held that the Elections Clause did not permit a state to refuse to print on the ballot the names of candidates for the U.S. House who already had served 3 terms there, or the names of candidates for the U.S. Senate who had already served 2 terms. The Supreme Court has explained that the Election Clause also imposes implicit restrictions on the power to regulate congressional elections. Neither Congress nor the states may attempt to dictate electoral outcomes or favor or disfavor certain classes of candidates. In Cook versus Greenlake, 2001, the court struck down a provision that required election officials to print a special warning on the ballot next to the name of any candidate for Congress who refused to support an amendment to the U.S. Constitution that would impose term limits for Congress. The court explained that the provision exceeded the state's power under the Elections Clause because it was plainly designed to favor candidates who supported term limits while placing others at a disadvantage. One unusual feature of the Election Clause is that it does not confer the power to regulate congressional elections on states as a whole, but rather the legislature of a state. The Supreme Court has construed the term legislature extremely broadly to include any entity or procedure that the state's constitution permits to exercise lawmaking power. Thus, laws regulating congressional elections may be enacted not only by a state's actual legislature, but also directly by state's voters through the initiative process or public referendum in states that allow such procedures. The court also has held that a legislature may delegate its authority over the election clause to other entities or officials. A few states have chosen to transfer power to draw congressional district lines from their respective legislature to nonpartisan or bipartisan independent redistricting commissions. These states believe that such commissions can make the electoral process more fair by preventing voters from being divided into congressional districts in ways that unduly protect existing office holders. Gerrymandering. As this summary shows, congressional elections are conducted under a complicated mix of state and federal laws, reflecting the Election Clause's division of authority between state legislatures and Congress. Now, this second section is matters debate. Enforcing the Elections Clause by preserving the role of legislatures, by Michael T. Morley. The power to make the rules governing the electoral process is perhaps the most important power conferred by the Constitution. by drawing congressional district boundaries differently, enhancing or weakening measures to protect the integrity of the electoral process, changing the standards concerning vote counting, or modify any of dozens of other rules concerning elections, it often is impossible to systematically help candidates from one political party over the other. The government officials empowered to determine the rules governing an election, therefore, can exert a tremendous influence over the election's outcome. The framers' Constitution sought to preserve the fairness of congressional elections by allowing state legislatures and ultimately Congress to regulate them. A majority, the modern Supreme Court, however, does not trust institutional state legislature to oversee the electoral process. Both legislatures and Congress are comprised of partisan elected representatives who might be tempted to tweak the rules to aid their political allies rather than promoting the public interest. Thus, in Arizona State Legislature versus Arizona Independent Redistricting Commission, AIRC, 2015, by a bare 5-4 majority, the court decided to ignore the plain meaning of the elections clause. It held that the word legislature does not mean what most people would assume. It does not refer to the body, each state comprised of elected officials, then periodically convenes to debate and enact laws. Rather, the term referred to any lawmaking process authorized by a state's constitution, including public referenda and initiatives in which members of the public vote directly to members of the public vote directly to enact the statute. Moreover, the court held that a state law may transfer power to regulate congressional elections away from the legislature to other entities such as executive branch officials or independent commissions. These holdings, while well-intentioned, are flatly wrong and directly contradict the plain meaning of the elections clause. The Constitution uses the term legislature repeatedly in every other place where the word appears in the Constitution. It clearly and unambiguously refers exclusively to a state's institutional legislature and not to other lawmaking processes such as public votes or referenda. Likewise, the term was used repeatedly throughout the debate over the Constitution to refer exclusively to an institutional legislature. And every single state constitution during the founding era that referred to a legislature defined it as a distinct multi-member body comprised of representatives. The AIRC majority chose to ignore the meaning of the term and instead effectively rewrote the elections clause to allow a state to exclude its institutional legislature from regulating congressional elections, even if the court were correct to doubt the ability of partisan legislatures to draw congressional districts or determine other election rules fairly. It cannot simply disregard the Constitution's clear text under the guise of interpretation to reach a better result. The election clause is the latest victim of results-oriented jurisprudence, which is a fancy label for mingling the constitutional meaning to achieve a good policy result, regardless of what the Constitution actually says. In any event, allowing independent commission to draw congressional district lines may not be much of an improvement over institutional state legislatures. In the legislature, everyone's partisan incentives and biases open the word. So-called independent commissions operate under a veneer of non-partisanship, which often means only that the participants' partisan preferences remain hidden, far less susceptible to public scrutiny. Most people with enough knowledge about and interest in redistricting to work with redistricting commissions are highly likely to have some sort of partisan preferences. Moreover, redistricting is not a science that can be conducted according to abstract principles. Deciding where to divide towns, what communities of interest must be maintained together, and which characteristics of a population are most salient in crafting districts are fundamentally political questions for which objective right answers do not exist. Different people reasonably can hold differing political views on these issues. There is no objective standard by which the work of a purportedly nonpartisan commission can be deemed any fairer than a map drawn by a legislature. The nature of the task unavoidably requires repeated exercise for subjective political judgment. An elected partisan legislature is quite likely a far more suitable entity for making such quintessentially partisan decisions than a supposedly technocratical bureaucracy. Another perspective, ordering state-federal relations through the Election Clause by Freneda Towson. The Election Clause gives the states and the federal government concurrent jurisdiction over congressional elections, granting states the power to set the times, places, and the manner of those elections, and delegating to Congress the authority to alter states' regulations or to make its own. From the founding until the mid-19th century, Congress used its make or alter authority sparingly, leading the regulation of federal elections to become, over time, a government function traditionally left to the states. In the last century and a half, however, Congress became more aggressive in exercising its authority under the clause, imposing substantial requirements that the states must follow in structuring federal elections. These requirements have included, for example, laying down minimal criteria for the state to follow regarding compactness, contiguity, and single-member districting for U.S. House elections, instituting uniform voter registration standards for federal elections through the National Voter Registration Act, modernizing state voting systems through the HELP American Vote Act. Despite the breadth of federal power, Congress rarely invoked the clause in order to nationalize election administration. Instead, Congress assumes that the state law is presumptively valid and will govern the nuts and the bolts of federal elections. The U.S. Supreme Court has recognized that the election clause is unique in how it structures the relationship between the states and the federal government, and these differences extend beyond the clause's focus on federal elections. Under the Supremacy Clause, for example, states retain authority over numerous policy areas, provided that there is no conflict with federal law. In contrast, the Elections Clause does not require conflict between state and federal law, and Congress can display state law and will. In Arizona versus Tribal Council of Arizona, 2013, The Supreme Court described Congress' power to regulate federal elections as paramount, noting that it may be exercised at any time and to any extent which Congress deems expedient. By giving Congress the ability to veto state regulations or construct its own laws, the framers created a safeguard against the state's potential abuse of their authority to regulate federal elections. One such example is the Foster v. Love, 1997, where the Supreme Court invalidated a Louisiana law that decreed the majority winner of the primary to be the winner of the U.S. House or Senate seat, negating the need for a general election. The court noted that the elections clause invested the states with responsibility for the mechanics of congressional election, but only so far as Congress declined to preempt state legislative choices. Federal law, which sets election day for House and Senate races, preempts the Louisiana law because the state law determines the winners from the results of the primary election, which was held on a day different from the federal mandated election day. With a few exceptions, however, states retain substantial authority under the clause to structure federal elections in a manner that is consistent with state law. In Arizona State Legislature versus Arizona Independent Redistricting Commission, AIRC 2015, the Supreme Court emphasized this aspect of state power, reading the term legislature in the clause broadly enough to encompass the ballot initiative process that Arizona's residents used to delegate the legislature's redistricting authority to an independent redistricting commission. By making the term legislature dependent upon the lawmaking procedures recognized by state law instead of fixed within the text of the election clause, the states, through its legislature and its citizens, retains a default role in determining how and through which body it wants to implement the times, places, and manner of federal elections. As the constitutional text and the history show, the Elections Clause provides a unique organizational structure that gives the states broad power to construct federal elections, but it ultimately delegated final policy-making authority to Congress. And that concluded the commentary on Article 1, the Election Clause.